What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last few episodes, I talked extensively about the U.S. Constitution, how it was created, why it was created, and what the guys who put it together were thinking about as they went through the process. I think that understanding those things is really important, vitally important, to understanding the way that American government works today and how our society and our government have evolved since the Constitution was written and ratified. So hopefully you got as much out of those episodes as I did doing them, because I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of the Constitution and where it came from before I did all of that stuff, before I did the research and put the episodes together. But I definitely got a lot out of the process myself. And I feel like I understand the Constitution even better than I did before I did all of it. So hopefully you feel the same way. But now it's time to move on. And I'm going to get into the Washington administration and the first few Congresses, as well as the beginnings of the judiciary. But before I do that, I thought it would be fun and interesting to dive into a subject that is really innocuous and non-controversial. Religion! Because nobody in America has really strong opinions about that, right? But seriously though, I do think it is really important to talk about this in the context of the birth of the new American government. Also, it just so happens to be the holiday season. I am dressed festively, as those of you watching on YouTube can see. By the way, I hope everybody who's celebrating, whether it's Christmas or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or some pagan, Wiccan, Satanist holiday that's going on at this time that I know nothing about. I hope you're celebrating, you're having a great holiday season, you're hanging out with friends and family, and if things are really going well, you're eating and drinking way too much. Because that's how you really enjoy yourself this time of year, right? I did want to talk about this because it's almost impossible to decouple American society and American government from religion. A lot of the people who came here from Europe to start over again, to create their own societies, did so for religious reasons. And there is this ever-present debate that is going on in the United States, mostly between people who are very hostile to religion and people who are very reverent and respectful of religion. And there's three specific reasons that I wanted to talk about this. Number one, there's a lot of bad takes from both sides about what the founding fathers wanted. You know, you've got the hostile to religion, atheistic, super secular side saying that religion has no place in the American government or in the public square, that the founding fathers themselves were pretty damn close to atheists, etc., so forth. And you've got the ultra-religious, Christian nationalist, in some cases, folks, who are trying to say that America is a Christian nation, that it was meant to be dominated by Christians, that there should be a Bible in every political office around the country, blah, 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 blah. And as is usually the case, I think the truth is very much in the middle of those extremes. Unfortunately, with discussions like this, to the extent that they remain discussions and not full-blown raging arguments, get hijacked by people on the extremes, and that's not good. And I don't think it helps anybody. It lacks nuance, and it just pits people against each other in a way that is completely unconstructive for everyone. Finally, I want to talk about this because the way that the Founding Fathers conceived of religion is, I think, quite important to understanding the government that they created. They certainly had it on their minds. Some of them were much more religious in a traditional way than others, but regardless of how religious or not they were, they all, to some extent, had it on their minds. There's a reason that the First Amendment to the Constitution deals specifically with religion. And it's not the only place where the Founding Fathers' input about religion in American society and American law can be found. I do want to say, before I get into the actual material, for the purpose of full disclosure, I was raised in a somewhat religious household. I grew up going to a Lutheran church. I went to a Methodist church toward the end of middle school and high school. I did go through the confirmation process, and I attended church pretty regularly through most of high school. However, at some point, and I don't know exactly when I was like 17 or 18, I kind of started to decide that it wasn't for me. And the subsequent experiences of my life into my later teenage years, early 20s, and the rest of adulthood have kind of reinforced that decision for me. I don't think organized religion is for me for any number of reasons. But that is not to say that I am hostile to organized religion. I'm not. I think religion is like so many other things in our society. It's not the thing itself, the instrument, the organization, that is inherently good or inherently bad. It's really what the people who engage with the thing make it. You could say a similar sort of thing about technology. Technology can do great things, it can do awful things. I would say the same thing about religion. There are wonderful, noble, amazing people who do what they do to help humankind and benefit their communities and so forth because of their religious beliefs, or at least in part because of their religious beliefs. And there are really horrible people who do horrible things, who do so in the name of religion, or at least that's what they say. So I don't think that religion in and of itself is inherently good or inherently bad. I think it's just about what the folks who engage with it do, and probably what they might have done even without religion being a part of their lives anyway. So you can do, as viewers or listeners, with that information what you will. Maybe listening to a not very religious guy talk about the religious beliefs of the Founding Fathers is something that turns you off or makes you think that I am not a good source of information. And if that's what you feel or if that's what you think, more power to you. But as is the case with every episode I've done up to this point, I'm not basing what I'm going to say on my own opinions. I'm not riffing about this stuff. I am taking what I've read by professional historians, scholars, academics who've got a lot of experience researching this stuff and writing about it, and I'm telling you what I've read that they've written. And so anything I have to say is going to be something that was written by a scholar on the subject that I find to be compelling or persuasive. And that's it. As with all the other episodes I've done, I'm going to give you a list of the resources that I've used, and I'm going to give you a question to think about as I'm going through this information. When it comes to the resources for this episode, I took a little tiny bit from the textbooks from the American Pageant and from Give Me Liberty, but they weren't big contributors to what I did for this episode. I also took some from The Glorious Cause because that gets into the process of creating the Constitution, the ideas of religious liberty of the Founding Fathers, and I took a little bit of information from there, but primarily what I'm putting into this episode comes from one book, and that is The Faiths of the Founding Fathers by David L. Holmes, who is a prominent historian specifically on religious history in the United States. And this book, it's only about 200 pages, maybe even a little less than that, and I think it's written in a very accessible way. And for any of you who might be interested in learning more than I'm going to say about the religious beliefs of the Founding Fathers, I would highly recommend it because this guy knows his stuff and it's not a very difficult read, I would say. Now, the question that I think it would be good for y'all to think about as I go through this information is this. What were the religious beliefs of the various Founding Fathers, and how did those beliefs and the religious tradition of the United States contribute to their vision for religious liberty in the government they designed? I'll say that one more time. What were the religious beliefs of the various Founding Fathers, and how did those beliefs and the religious tradition in the United States contribute to their vision for religious liberty in the government that they designed? So that's the question you can think about as I'm going through this. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to start with just a brief overview of the history of religion in the colonies / United States up until 1770. So it would still be the colonies technically because Declaration of Independence in 1776. But I've been over all this stuff before in previous episodes. I don't think there's anything I'm covering here that is new, but I wanted to reiterate it for anybody who might be watching this as a standalone and hasn't seen any of the other episodes, because it is important context. So I'm just going to first spend 5 to 10 minutes talking about the religious history of the United States up until 1770. And then I'm going to get into the various founding fathers and what they thought and how that influenced them in the process of making the American government. So, first off, the American colonies and then the United States was arguably the most religiously pluralistic society in the 18th and even back to the 17th centuries. Lots of different religious traditions were present in the United States by the time you get to 1770. Of course, there are Anglicans, members of the Church of England, the official state church that broke away from the Catholic Church in the 16th century. There's Presbyterians, who are effectively Scottish Puritans. They broke away from the Church of England because they thought it was too similar to the Roman Catholic Church in too many ways. Same thing goes for the Congregationalists, also known as the English Puritans. They broke away from the Church of England because they thought it was too much like the Roman Catholic Church, and they are, the Congregationalists anyway, the descendants of the Pilgrims or Puritans who came over in the first half and in the second half too of the 1600s. There are Catholics in the colonies. One of the colonies, of course, Maryland, was started out at least in part as a haven for Catholics. Didn't quite work out that way, but it was started in that spirit by Catholic founders. The Calvert family from England. There were Jewish settlers who came to the colonies way back as far as the 1600s. There were Jews who settled in some of the colonies. Not a lot, but they existed. Later in the 18th century, you get a number of German immigrants coming over, and they bring with them their own religion. This is mostly what we would call Moravians and then Lutherans, and they become quite prominent in certain colonies where they settle. In the 1600s into the 1700s, you get a trickle, not necessarily a great number of these folks, but you do get some Huguenots. These are French Calvinists. In France, in the 1700s, back to the 1600s too, Catholicism dominates, and the Huguenots are kind of a persecuted minority. These are, again, Calvinists, so they're Protestants. Off and on throughout French history, they're picked on and abused, and so a lot of them try to get out and come to the New World, same way that the Puritans did. And then finally, you get a group from England known as the Quakers, or the Society of Friends. It's a small group, but pretty influential. And so all of these different groups are gathering together in the colonies. The Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Puritans, the Catholics, the Jews, the Moravians, the Lutherans, the Huguenots, the Quakers. I don't think any country or principality or anything like that in Europe had this level of religious pluralism. The colonies stand out for that reason alone when it comes to religion. There are eventually regional differences in the various colonies. In New England, which was settled, remember, mostly by people seeking religious freedom from the oppression, usually of the Church of England, in their view. In New England, the Congregationalist Church, the English Puritan Church, comes to dominate, especially in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. It's a little different in some of the other New England colonies, but Congregationalists are one of the biggest denominations in the American colonies in the 16 and 1700s. Anglicans, or members of the Church of England, tend to dominate in the South, especially in the Tidewater coastal regions of Virginia, South Carolina. It's the wealthy, established kind of aristocracy that, not surprisingly, clings to the old English tradition of the Church of England. You know, they want to be more establishment, they want to be the aristocracy of the New World, and so it's not really surprising that they stuck with the state religion of England. The middle colonies are definitely the most diverse, and in the middle colonies, you've got the two biggest cities, which, not surprisingly, makes it a little more diverse, but in those middle colonies, and I'm talking about New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware. Those are the middle colonies. You get Puritans, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Lutherans, Moravians, Catholics, Jews, Quakers, all of them in varying numbers. Now, with all of these different groups there, as you might expect, if you didn't already know, there is some conflict. And some of these groups very much don't like each other. The Puritans and a lot of the Congregationalists definitely didn't care for the Catholics. So that was a volatile mixture of folks. And though there are attempts at religious toleration, which is not the same thing as religious freedom, toleration just means these people aren't going to be abused and oppressed. It does not mean do whatever you feel like. That is religious freedom, and the freedom potentially to not be religious, which is not something that is discussed to a great extent until you get to the revolution and the post-revolutionary period. In the 1700s, there are some attempts, pre-revolution, at least religious toleration. There is in England, for example, the 1689 Act of Toleration. And that then means that members of the Church of England can't be castigated or oppressed or abused by, say, Puritans, who are a little hostile to them. There's also in Maryland, kind of famously and infamously, the 1649 Act concerning religion. It gets misinterpreted a lot as something that made Maryland a safe haven for Catholics and Catholics were cool there or whatever. Not really how it worked out in practice. Pretty quickly, the Catholics were a minority. Power between Catholics and Protestants seesawed back and forth. Catholics were often in the minority, and so Protestants were able to grab power from time to time. And when they did occasionally, they went after the Catholics. So even though the founding family, the proprietary founders of Maryland, were Catholic, the Calvert, that didn't mean that it was great to be Catholic in the state of Maryland, in the colony of Maryland. By the way, as was the case in most of Europe, 9 of the 13 colonies had a state-sponsored church. The most common ones were the Congregationalist Church and the Church of England. I've talked about this before, but a colony like Rhode Island and another like North Carolina that had this big independent streak and we're not going to cotton to authority and we're not going to bend the knee to anybody who tells us what to do, they did not have official state churches. That went against their ethos in many ways. But a lot of colonies did. A number of the most famous universities we have in the United States, some of the oldest ones, the Ivy Leagues, they were established either as religious schools, seminaries from the outset, or they had a religious association from the beginning. Examples of that, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, they were all Congregationalist. King's College, eventually Columbia, and William and Mary were both Anglican. And Princeton was Presbyterian. Of course, there is a religious earthquake in the colonies in the 1730s and 40s known as the Great Awakening. And that fundamentally changes the religion picture in the colonies for quite a while to come. It began, as I said, in the 1730s and became a huge movement by the late 30s, 40s. John Wesley and Charles Wesley are two of the prominent figures in this movement, and they started the Methodist Church. When I think of the Great Awakening, probably the first thing that I think of is big, outdoor, very emotional, very demonstrative religious revivals. You still see those things fairly frequently in many parts of the United States. And there are 2 preachers in particular that I associate with this, that most historians associate with this whole movement. And those 2 gentlemen are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. So Edwards and Whitefield would go to these various places and have these big revivals. There'd be this emotional conversion. This is where you see people wallowing and speaking in tongues and all that kind of thing. And this was the ethos of the Great Awakening, was this emotional conversion and kind of a rejection of expertise, of clerics, of learned people who looked at religion very intellectually. The Great Awakening results in this emphasis of what we call lay piety. Average people being just as connected to God and to religion as any theologian or any clergyman might be. And it leads to establishment of some new denominations on top of the ones that I already mentioned. There's the first Baptist church ever before the Great Awakening in Providence, Rhode Island, that's started by Roger Williams. That denomination, the Baptist, grows exponentially because of the Great Awakening. Prior to the Great Awakening, the Baptist church was pretty small and just located in a few places. The Great Awakening gives it a big shot in the arm, and it becomes one of the biggest denominations in the colonies and in the United States after the Great Awakening hits. As you might expect, based on the other stuff that I've said, Baptists' emphasis on personal conversion, baptism of believers only, so being baptized at birth doesn't really make you saved in the eyes of Baptists. And the Baptist challenge to state churches and to high up clergy and religious authority, all of those things helped the church grow during the Great Awakening. Evangelicalism, the notion that men and women had to be born again by accepting Jesus as their Savior and reforming their lives, that's something that comes out of the Great Awakening. And of course, evangelicalism is a very big part of the United States into the present. So this is where it starts. The movement, the Great Awakening, eventually spread to slaves and other African Americans, but not until the 1770s. So it took a few decades for this movement to catch on in those communities. But the notion of new birth appealed to people who were enslaved, who did not have agency. The evangelical tradition became a big part of African American culture, both among enslaved and free African Americans. So that's the broad strokes of things up until about 1770. Now I'm going to get into the founders and what they thought. The Church of England and Virginia are very closely tied together, and I'm talking about Virginia specifically because a lot of the guys that I'm going to talk about are from Virginia. Virginia was dominated by the Church of England, especially the Tidewater region, the East Coast, where a lot of these important founders were from. It was sort of the middle way between Catholicism and Calvinism. It looks a lot like a Catholic church service if you were to walk into a Church of England service, or in the United States now, Episcopalian service. It's kind of Protestant, but also it has a lot of Catholic DNA. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, James Monroe, all born and baptized in the Church of England, just to give you a picture of how prominent, how influential it was in Virginia. All those guys are from Virginia. All of these guys were educated in Church of England institutions, schools that were associated or run by the Church of England in some way. By the 1760s, the Church of England had 250 churches in over 100 parishes in Virginia, all the way out to what is now Kentucky, and at that time was considered a part of Virginia. The big influential change, the thing that maybe has the most impact on the founders and how they look at religion, is the development of what is called deism. So I want to first explain what deism is. It comes from the European Enlightenment, and it's probably best exemplified by the likes of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Diderot, who were all what we would call philosophes, members of the French intellectual community that really embraced the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is this big intellectual movement that takes place more or less between the Glorious Revolution in England in the late 1600s and the French Revolution in the late 1700s. And the Enlightenment challenges a lot of what had been traditional ways of looking at the world. Sort of ironically, the work of English members of the Scientific Revolution that leads into the Enlightenment, like Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton, it contributes, their work does, to the worldview that the deists take on, despite the fact that all three of those guys, Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton, were members of the Church of England, and fairly at least active in it from my understanding. But Bacon, Locke, and Newton all wrote about things and did things that helped the deists sort of figure out what they thought of how the universe worked. Bacon talked about mathematics and the logic of nature, if you will. Locke talked about natural rights. His views informed a lot of the founding fathers and what they thought about government and so forth. And then Newton is the father of physics and the first guy to try to really explain thoroughly how the universe worked. So it's these guys working on their various intellectual pursuits that forms the deistic point of view in a lot of ways. Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, an immigrant to the United States just before the revolution really got going, was probably the most ardent supporter of deism in the United States, what would be the United States. Paine was criticized as an atheist for his deistic views, but Paine did believe in God, so calling him an atheist is inaccurate. He just did not believe in the specific dogma of Christianity. And whether his conception of God is the same as that of people who worship in the Christian tradition or in the Muslim tradition or in any other tradition that has a monotheistic conception of God, I'm not really sure that his conception of God and that conception of God match up. Generally speaking, deists emphasized logic and reason over scripture. And a number of them found biblical revelation, the notion that the Bible was to be taken literally and that it revealed information that otherwise human beings wouldn't have, as superstitious. If you were to Google deism, what you might run across is this definition of the universe as governed by natural laws, and that God had set up those natural laws and then was very hands-off with how the universe unfolded. The favorite metaphor of deists was God as a watchmaker or God as a clockmaker, which is to say that God created the universe and gave it natural law and then stepped away from it and didn't really interfere. So deists generally believed that God was very hands-off when it came to the day-to-day lives of human beings. That's not universal, and there are shades and differences in belief among deists as there are in most any belief system, but that is probably the most accessible and easy to define way that one can describe deism. Deism definitely allowed some people to embrace spirituality and say that there was something higher than what was perceptible by human beings without buying into, as they would put it, the dogma of organized religion. A lot of deists believed in God, had a spiritual side to them, but did not think that organized religion was an overall net good for humanity. Again, that's not everybody, but that's a number of deists. And they, in particular, objected to the sectarianism of organized religion, which, to be fair, in the lives of a lot of 18th century, well-educated, intellectual people, it was kind of hard not to look at the last few centuries of European existence, of existence in the Mediterranean world, where there was all this conflict between Protestants and Catholics, between Christians of every stripe and Muslims, and not understand why they may have been a little suspect or even cynical when it comes to religion. As far as deism's introduction to America, it didn't start with Thomas Paine. It got there before he did. Deism had a presence in the United States, the colonies, by 1725. By the 1750s, Orthodox clergy, more traditional Christian clergy, warned against it as it became popular, and in American colleges in particular, they saw it as a threat. The College of William and Mary, which I mentioned as an Anglican institution, it was, became the epicenter of deism in Virginia. Kind of noteworthy in this instance because that's where Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe were both educated and where George Washington was a chancellor. Washington never went to college himself, but he did get involved in the institution. Of the founding fathers that I'm going to discuss, it was only Madison who went to a more or less orthodox Christian institution, in his case, Princeton, which was Presbyterian, if you recall, and had a pretty traditional Presbyterian approach to education, I guess you would say. Franklin, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe could all be categorized as deists or Unitarians or maybe a little bit of both. And though the movement had a lot of influence in the 1700s in particular in the United States, it was clearly on the decline by the early 1800s, in no small part because there was a backlash against the French Revolution, which had this very hostile to organized religion component. There were a lot of people who looked at the French Revolution and its various attacks on organized religion and sort of pushed back against something like deism, which they saw as at least a cousin of that. Now I'm going to get into some of the specifics of the Founding Fathers, and I'm going to start with the guys who were what we would generally consider to be deists. Ben Franklin, first and foremost. Franklin was raised a Calvinist, but by the time he was 15, according to his writings and his diary and so forth, he had become a deist. Though not a deist who wholly rejected ritual and prayer and divine intervention. He, Franklin, tended to think that theology was, as he put it, focused on petty distinctions, but noted that religion was helpful in providing moral guidance to humanity and order to societies, which I tend to agree with. He was suspicious, was Franklin, of the innate goodness of humanity, but wasn't a propagandist for deism the way that Thomas Paine might be described. Franklin, generally speaking, was kind of ambivalent when it came to organized religion and came to believe that no system was all right or all wrong, and it kind of helps to explain his emphasis on the importance of religious toleration, which he did write about and talk about quite a bit. Apparently, when Franklin was close to the end of his life, he got a letter from a Congregationalist minister, that's the Puritans, about his faith. The minister was asking him about his faith, and shortly before Franklin died, he gave this response, which I'm going to read word for word. Quote, "Here is my creed. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs the world by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we can render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion." That very much sounds like a deist to me. He's not embracing the specific language of Christianity. He's not saying Jesus is his savior. He's not saying anything else very specific that other founders who had more orthodox Christian views would say. But he is saying that there is something after this life, that one's behavior in this life has something to do with one's fate in the afterlife, and that there is some kind of supreme being. George Washington. Now, he's a little bit more controversial in terms of the way that he and his religious beliefs have been written about. There's been a lot of back and forth about Washington, and it makes sense when you think about it because he is such a central, influential, important figure in American life. He's like the founding father. So it's not surprising that people would argue about what his religious beliefs were. He was raised an Anglican, like the other guys I mentioned, being from Virginia, and considered religiously active in the church. Washington would read services for his soldiers as a member of the British military when no chaplain was available. A lot of this influence, as was the case with a number of the Founding Fathers, probably comes from his wife, Martha, who was apparently quite a devout Anglican in a more traditional way than Washington himself was. While he was president, Washington attended Episcopal services. At this point, it's the Episcopal Church. It's not the Church of England anymore because the United States is now an independent country. But sometimes Washington did go to other services. It wasn't exclusively Episcopalian services that he attended. He attended church more frequently during crises or when in a city because there were more churches that were available to him to attend. But he didn't attend church as much, apparently, when he was at home in Mount Vernon, or when he was traveling, or when there wasn't some serious crisis afoot. It is apparently not conclusively known. It's a matter of debate to some degree whether he received communion before and during the Revolution. But evidence points to no communion afterward. And that is a noteworthy thing to consider, because receiving communion was something that only very devout people did. Apparently, there were a number of attendees at Episcopal services who went to the main service, and when communion was given after the main service, left. And that was apparently the pattern that Washington followed for most of his life, at least after the Revolution was over. His wife, Martha, did regularly receive communion. Deists would have seen that ritual, communion, and the notion of the presence of Jesus in the bread and the wine as superstition. And so it's reasonable to conclude from Washington's decision not to receive communion that he might have seen it as a little bit superstitious. His letters reveal his references to God not as God or the Savior or Lord or Father or Redeemer, but in this language: providence, heaven, the deity, the supreme being, the grand architect. And those are the kinds of terms that deists typically use when they referred to God, not in a very specific way that Christians or devout Jews or Muslims or people of other religious faiths will use when they refer to God. So it seems from his writing, again, that he leaned into the more deistic point of view. Washington also importantly helped establish religious liberty and toleration as central principles in the American government. Even for non-Christians and non-believers, he thought it was important. And again, if you see all of this conflict between different religious groups while you're alive, you might understand why a guy like Washington, who is so concerned about the survival of the United States, would want to ensure that there is no further source of conflict among Americans like religion. After his death, Orthodox Christians tried to claim that Washington was one of them. Jefferson, Madison, other pastors that knew Washington and his behavior when it came to religion pushed back on this pretty significantly, though. You can see some of the evidence for why they might have done that in his letters, as I've mentioned. John Adams. So John Adams, I would say, is more of a Unitarian than a deist. He could be called kind of a Christian deist, possibly. Unitarians in Adams' day were not exactly what they are now. They believed God was one and that Jesus was sent by God but remained subordinate to him. So not so much in the idea of a trinity. Adams was of the anti-Trinitarians who believed that Jesus was from below, that he was a human rather than directly related or a piece of God, the way that a lot of Christians believe. Jesus was raised to divinity because of his behavior. So Adams, was somebody who believed that Jesus was a man, was mortal, but was raised to the status of divinity because of his divine behavior in life. The Unitarian interpretation harkened back to early Christianity, this Unitarian interpretation anyway, before the Trinity was embraced by the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church. Because if you go back to the very beginnings of Christianity, there are some different interpretations of how Christians should worship and what they should believe. And there is one of them that says that Jesus was not necessarily God or a piece of God, but rather a mortal man carrying God's message. Another thing that set Unitarians apart from Orthodox Christians is the notion that they objected, did Unitarians, to the notion that the human race had been corrupted since Adam and Eve, and they also objected to the notion that Calvinists had put forward of predestination, the idea that God knows even before you're born whether or not you're going to be saved, going to heaven. This part of the Unitarians, they were kind of considered like the left-wing Congregationalists, the more liberal Congregationalists, who very much did believe in the notion of Calvinist predestination. Adams actually thought about the ministry when he was a young man. But apparently, he was turned away from that career path by the intolerance that he saw, particularly during his time at Harvard. He thought that the Congregationalist ministry was pretty dogmatic, and he didn't agree with this notion that man was inherently depraved. Adams did attend church regularly. He believed in the notion that God was responsive to people, in the idea of a personal God, if you will. He believed in guiding providence. He believed in the resurrection of Jesus and life after death. So those are slightly more Orthodox Christian views that some of the other deists or Unitarians wouldn't necessarily hold. Abigail, his wife, was the daughter of a Congregationalist minister, actually. So he was not hardcore opposed to church life if you look at it in that light. But Adams also asserted that humans should study nature and use reason to learn about God and creation. So he was not somebody that apparently believed in a literal interpretation of Scripture the way that Orthodox Christians would. Thomas Jefferson is probably, of all the founding fathers, the most philosophical. There's a good quote in the book that I'm talking about, The Faith of the Founding Fathers, from a historian who focuses on religion of a slightly earlier time. His name is Edwin S. Gustaud. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But Gustaud, if that's how in fact his name is pronounced, called Jefferson the, quote, most self-consciously theological of all America's presidents. And that is to say that Jefferson had the most powerful feelings in many directions regarding religion. Jefferson, was baptized Anglican, raised Anglican, attended mostly Anglican William and Mary, but discovered deism there because, as I've mentioned already, it took on a little bit of a deist bent a little before he was there, actually. He remained outwardly Anglican and Episcopalian then throughout his life because, of course, during his life, the United States breaks away from England and therefore the Church of England becomes Episcopalian. But most historians, I think, tend to think that Jefferson was Unitarian. Like a lot of deists, Unitarians, Jefferson criticized organized religion and fiercely opposed established churches and religious coercion. He was one of the biggest advocates for religious liberty in the American government. He was criticized, in fact, by Alexander Hamilton when he ran for president in 1800 as, quote, an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics. He wasn't an atheist. He believed in a God, just not in the same way that more Orthodox Christians did. Jefferson was, he would call it, I think, a restorationist. He pined for the early days of Christianity, similar to deism and Protestantism. He believed power-hungry monarchs and corrupt priests had fouled the original, pristine teachings of Jesus. That era was the golden era of Christianity, which is actually, again, kind of ironically, similar to the way that a lot of Protestants, Puritans even, looked at Christianity. They saw Catholicism as a corruption of what had been the original purity of Christianity. Jefferson had a very earthly view of Christianity, such as he did. He did not see Jesus as a savior, nor as a performer of miracles. In fact, Jefferson wrote his own version of the New Testament, from which he removed anything unreasonable and ended it with Jesus' death rather than with Jesus' death followed by his resurrection. So he wrote this version of the New Testament without the miracles and without the, what he might call, supernatural or superstitious stuff, and just treated it as though Jesus was a man. Like most deists, he rejected the rituals and sacraments of institutional religion, such as communion, and sort of put his money where his mouth is, so to speak, when it came to offering legislation in this regard. He wrote the Act for Establishing Religious Freedom of 1786, which became a model in many ways for much legislation that dealt with the religious liberty of people in various states and according to the federal government. And the last of the deists that I'm going to discuss, James Madison. He was baptized as Anglican, and his mother was apparently a devout Anglican and then Episcopalian after the Revolution, who spent a lot of time in church. Madison was not actively hostile to organized religion, but pushed hard for religious liberty since the age of 22. So that was a very important issue to him at a pretty young age. He insisted on freedom of conscience in Virginia in the Constitution rather than just toleration, which I discussed sort of the difference between toleration and liberty. Freedom of conscience would protect, then, people who were not religious, and that's something that Madison saw as important. He didn't want anybody to be discriminated against or oppressed based on their religious beliefs. Further, Madison objected to subsidizing any church, so providing state funds for a church, such as the Church of England, which became pretty common practice after the Revolution was over to get away from giving public money to churches. In addition to all of this, Madison regularly pushed for separation of church and state, and he is very definitely one of the leaders in prescribing that formula for American society, that the government should be over here and that churches should be over here, and that they should not have undue influence over one another. His own religious worship is opaque from what I've read. We don't really know to what extent he did any religious worship, and he didn't write a lot about it the same way that Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin did. On occasion, Madison did express admiration for Unitarian principles, and there is one instance in particular where he seated himself next to, I believe it was a Unitarian minister, intellectual, at a state dinner, or at, maybe not a state dinner, but at a formal White House dinner, and made sure to talk to the guy because he wanted to get into a conversation with him about religion. We also know that he talked about the Sabbath as something not needing to be strictly observed. He opposed appointment of chaplains to Congress and the military, and opposed executive proclamations using religious language, which is something that some presidents did and do. Only occasionally did he go to church while he was president in D.C. with his wife Dolly. He was, I think you could say, the most aggressively in favor of religious toleration and of separation between church and state. That was a guiding principle of his political life. But, as I suggested at the beginning of all this, there are not just deists that are involved as leaders in the revolution, in the designing of the American government. There are Orthodox Christians as well. And there's a few that I'll discuss here. The first of which is Samuel Adams, who is probably the most noteworthy example of a quite religious man who had a lot of influence over the revolution and over the founding of the new government. He is sometimes referred to as the Cato of the American Revolution, as in ancient Roman Cato, for advocating a return to earlier, simpler life in New England, the way that Cato did about the Roman Republic. He's best known, though, as the last of the Puritans, mostly because of his religious orthodoxy and his commitment to Congregationalist church life. He got politically active pretty early on. He was Justice of the Peace, he was a representative to the Massachusetts Assembly, and while that is a big part of his life, and of course he was an important figure in the Revolution, he was also called Deacon Adams. He was referred to that regularly for his association with the Old South Congregationalist Church, which I believe is in Boston. He was a founder as well of the New South Church, and like John Adams, his cousin, he married a pastor's daughter, who, unfortunately, sadly for him, died shortly after the birth of a child. Early on in the Revolution, you see Adams' commitment to his religious principles. He denounces England's tyranny and popery. And this is something that I discussed in earlier episodes, talking about the difference between Protestants and Catholics and that whole movement. Puritans, like Adams, they literally thought the Pope was the Antichrist. And though the Church of England, as I've said, is not the same as the Catholic Church, it is close enough that a lot of people like Adams would have denounced it in that kind of language and been perfectly fine with it. Adams, you could say, came by his religiosity honestly. His mother was apparently influenced a great deal by Jonathan Edwards, the Great Awakening preacher, but he, Adams, was a lifelong Orthodox Congregationalist, did not join in, the New Light religions that came about because of the Great Awakening. He prayed regularly with family and strictly observed the Sabbath. He also attempted to revive the Puritan covenant theology in post-revolution Massachusetts, though apparently that didn't really take. Apparently there weren't a lot of people interested in that old school pursuit of Calvinist Puritan ideology that had been a big part of the New England colonies in the 17th century. Adams believed that God rewarded or chastised society according to its morality. So if God judged society to be immoral, he would punish society. If God judged society to be righteous, he would reward that society. That, again, is the kind of thing that you see amongst pretty religious figures today, right? You'll see a lot of people who are very religious say that something bad happening to the United States is a result of moral rot in the country. He favored tax-supportive churches, which set him apart from James Madison, for example, and he was unsuccessful in persuading his contemporaries of the desirability of a return to more religious, simpler life post-revolution, though that's something he advocated for a la Cato. That's something that did not, as the covenant theology, did not have a lot of takers. It's not something people were willing to embrace. So that's one example of an Orthodox Christian who had a lot of influence. There's another guy named Elias Boudinot. He was president of the Continental Congress, signer of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, member of the Committees of Correspondence, those revolutionary groups that encouraged revolution and brought about communication among the colonies so they could coordinate with one another and prepare for war with Britain. He was from New Jersey, so he was part of a Committee of Correspondence from New Jersey, and he was a member of the House of Representatives from New Jersey from 1795 to 1805. So he was a person very involved in the early days of the U.S. government and in the Revolution. He was president of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States. So you see his commitment to religious life by being the head of an organization like that. He was president of the New Jersey Bible Society. In addition to that, he was the first president of the American Bible Society, another organization. So he was very committed to his religious pursuits. Apart from that, Boudinot wrote books on the imminent return of Jesus, the rapture, the second coming. He wrote a biography of a leader of the Great Awakening, in addition to that, and he wrote a book refuting Deism, which I'll mention in a little more detail in a moment. He was, as his name suggests, it sounds like a French surname, right? Boudinot, it's Boudinot, the descendant of Huguenots, French Huguenots. Those are the French Calvinists again. He was baptized by George Whitefield himself, actually, though he was a Huguenot. So you can see the influence of the Great Awakening on his life. He married into a wealthy family after studying law and was a close associate of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was apparently a protege of his. So he gained influence by marrying into this family, but he was someone interested in organizations and leadership, obviously, from a very early age. His 1801 book, The Age of Revelation, was intended to refute Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason, which The Age of Reason was Paine's explanation of his deistic beliefs and kind of a rejection of more organized religion, Orthodox Christianity. Boudinot wrote this book called The Age of Revelation to contradict and disagree with Paine in public and give the Christian perspective on why Paine and deism in general were incorrect in his view. Boudinot proposed that Napoleon, during his reign, could be the Antichrist, and he looked for the reunification of the nation of Israel and believed Native Americans were part of the lost tribes of Israel. So again, it's more kind of religious symbolism, iconography, whatever you want to call it, that had a profound influence over his life, and he was like Adams in that way. Finally, there's John Jay, who I've mentioned in previous episodes, was an important influential figure, helped negotiate the peace treaty with Britain for the end of the war, was an ambassador to Spain, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, negotiated, of course, the Jay Treaty, which I'll get into in the coming episodes. He was president of the Continental Congress as well, and so you see his influence over a lot of things, and his belief system was quite different from, say, James Madison or Benjamin Franklin. Samuel Adams thought Jay was maybe even too religious. So a guy like Samuel Adams, who was quite religious himself, looked at Jay and thought, maybe that guy's taking it a bit too far. Tells you something of Jay's commitment to his faith. He, Jay, was an evangelical Episcopalian who believed the Bible, this is a direct quote, "The Bible contains a connected series of divine revelations and dispensations." So that is the kind of thing that George Washington, James Madison, other deists would have looked at as perhaps superstitious, but something that Jay believed pretty fervently. He generally was considered a Huguenot from birth because apparently his mother was of French Huguenot descent. He converted, as did many Huguenots eventually, to Anglican, the Church of England. He also believed that divine intervention occurred often, and he saw its influence apparently everywhere. So a lot of things that happened, as many religious people do, Jay explained through divine intervention, that God was working in some way incomprehensible to humans. He believed in a literal fall of humanity, the literal Noah flood story, the Tower of Babel, and a future revelation to happen, a rapture, millennium event, something like that, like some kind of apocalypse, basically. He routinely avoided religious discussions with his deist friends, like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, like James Madison. But he also firmly believed in a life after death, which you're seeing that just because you're a deist doesn't mean that you're in this little box and you can't believe in things that Orthodox Christians like Jay would have believed. So it's a kind of complicated picture. Taking all of this information together, what I conclude is that yes, religion played an important role in the colonies and in the founding of the country. Yes, all of these men had some version of faith, but it was also quite different depending on the person that you're talking about. And I think one of the common threads that you see when you look at these gentlemen who had so much influence over the beginning of our government at a crucial point is that they might have had different beliefs, they might have disagreed vehemently with each other, but they respected each other's ability to have their own beliefs. And generally speaking, from what I've read, they did not want to inject their own beliefs aggressively into the law or into the government. Some might have been okay with things or even push for things like state sponsorship of churches, but that was not a position held by a lot of the most influential founding fathers. And it was not a position that was taken up at the founding of the new American government. It's in the First Amendment, and it's in other spaces in the Constitution and other founding documents. All of the religious upheaval that a lot of these folks had experienced during their lives would lead one to think that they did not want to continue that sort of thing in the United States. The United States had plenty of problems to deal with, excluding religious conflict. I think it's pretty fair to say that a lot of these men were spiritual, they valued religious ideals, they thought they were important even if they themselves were not really strictly worshiping Christians. They thought religion played an important role in society, but they did not want to foist a lot of religious beliefs onto Americans. And they did not want religion to be an oppressive force in American society. That much I'm pretty confident about. Neither do I think that they were atheistic, totally secular, deistic, freewheeling 18th century hippies. I don't think that's true either. So there it is. Again, I would welcome all of you and recommend to all of you that you read a little more on the subject yourself. Faith of the Founding Fathers is a really good place to start. I hope this was interesting and useful to all of you. I hope you got something good out of it. Thank you very much for watching as always. Please like and subscribe if you've not already done so. You can feel free to contact me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com or leave me a voicemail or text message at 951-553-5525. Thanks very much. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Happy holidays once again.